In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is addressed to the Treasurer. Why is the government congratulating itself today when almost 1 million Australians are unemployed, 1.4 million Australians are underemployed, and for Australians who have jobs, wages growth is at record lows? Why is the government congratulating itself and using marketing slogans when so many Australians don't have a job?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the only person who's disappointed in today's national accounts is the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, because today's national accounts shows that the economic recovery is underway. The economic recovery that every Australian has worked hard for, Mr Speaker. And the congratulations go to every Australian who has made sacrifices in order to see the resilience of our economy produce the result that we have seen today. And that result in today's national accounts for the September quarter has seen a 3.3% increase, the single largest quarterly increase in GDP since 1976, Mr Speaker, since 1976. And this
member for Ballarat.
And these national count numbers have been driven by households. Household consumption up by 7.9% after falling by 12.5% in the June quarter.
I just say to the Treasurer, if you could just pause for a second. I listened carefully to the question, and it wasn't about the national accounts. I appreciate they've been released today, and I appreciate he'll no doubt take questions on them, but he wasn't asked about that. He was asked about unemployment and underemployment.
Well, Mr Speaker, we know that the national economic recovery is underway, and one of the key indicators of that is the number of people who are finding a job, Mr Speaker. 178,000 jobs were created last month, Mr Speaker. We have seen the effective unemployment rate, which takes into account those who have lost their job or seen their working hours reduced to zero, fall from a peak of 14.9% to 7.4% today, Mr Speaker. We've seen the participation rate increase to 65.8%, near the levels it was at the start of the pandemic, Mr Speaker. We have seen very strong labour market growth, Mr Speaker, even stronger than has been expected. So the Australian economy is showing remarkable resilience. But this is due to the achievements and to the sacrifices of millions of Australians across the country. These results, these better performance and economic indicators, is a sign of their hard work, and the results belong to them.
The member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on Australia's economic comeback from the COVID-19 pandemic and how the Morrison government will continue to support families and businesses by delivering on our national recovery plan to create economic growth and more jobs for Australians?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bennelong for his question, and I thank him through him, I thank all of his constituents and Australians all around the country, as the Treasurer has just done, for their magnificent efforts over these many months now during the course of the pandemic, which has been the key ingredient to the comeback that is now certainly underway from the COVID-19 recession. Mr Speaker, I know the member for Bennelong will join with all government members also in looking forward to Garth Hamilton, the newly elected declared member for his seat there, Mr Speaker, of Groom, who will be joining us soon, and we congratulate him on his election. But, Mr Speaker, that comeback is underway, and that comeback is built, Mr Speaker, on the strong public health response that has been put in place all around the country. The Governor of the Reserve Bank has said quite plainly that we have turned the corner. He has said the recovery is underway, and indeed the national accounts figures that have been released today confirm the accuracy of what the Governor of the Reserve Bank has said and the Treasurer has already referred to, of 3.3% growth in this September quarter. Mr Speaker, while we welcome the news, as I'm sure all Australians would, of the technical definition of a recession being concluded, we know, as all Australians know, that we still have a very long way to go. There are still Australians that we need to get back into jobs. There are still Australian businesses that remain heavily impacted by COVID-19 and the restrictions, particularly the international travel restrictions that are in place. And that's why the government continues to support and respond to those issues, whether it's the travel agents in particular, that we've announced particular measures just this week, because we understand and we adapt, and we are continuing to work with all Australians around the country so we can keep the comeback going, so we can keep the recovery on its path, Mr Speaker, on its path to ensure that Australians get back into jobs, that we continue to save livelihoods, that we continue to get Australians on the right track to where they want to be in 2021. Mr Speaker, more Australians will get into jobs. That's what the OECD is saying. The economy will continue to grow. That's the optimistic outlook that has been upgraded for Australia. And it is Australians who have responded to the strong measures that we've put in place as a government. They are the ones who've taken up those opportunities. They are the ones who, because of those supports, have been able to plan for their own future, for their own way of ensuring that they come out of this COVID-19 recession and they have more choices for them and their families and their communities. It has also been a demonstration of the wisdom of the measures in the budget, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we're driving investment in the Australian economy through the many tax incentives and initiatives outlined by the Treasurer this year. That economic recovery plan is working, Mr Speaker. It's working for all Australians. It's set us on the right path. It has stood us out globally. We will continue on that path and we'll continue to stand by Australians.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer and refers to his and the Prime Minister's answers. Why hasn't the government mentioned the following comments by the Reserve Bank Governor today? These figures, this is a quote, "These figures cannot hide the reality that recovery will be uneven and bumpy and it will be drawn out. Some parts of the economy are doing quite well, but others are in considerable difficulty."
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, obviously the member for Rankin wasn't watching my presentation. The National Accounts was pretty busy. He was busy looking in the mirror, Mr Speaker, because what I actually did say, Mr Speaker, what I actually did
Members
say.
on my left.
The member for Rankin might want to listen. This is what I actually said announcing on the National Accounts. The road
Members
ahead,
on my left.
Mr Speaker.
Members on my left. The member for Rankin. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, this is what I said. The road ahead will be long, it will be hard, and it will be bumpy, Mr Speaker. But the Australian economy has demonstrated its remarkable resilience. Mr Speaker, maybe it's not just the Leader of the Opposition, but maybe it's also the member for Rankin, who are the only ones across the country who are disappointed in seeing the biggest increase in the national accounts in the September quarter since 1976. Now, Mr Speaker, our focus has been unequivocally focused on getting more people into jobs and helping to create more employment across the country. More than 500,000 jobs having been created, Mr Speaker, over the last 5 months, having seen the effective unemployment rate come down from a peak of 14.9% down to 7.4% today. There is a long, hard and bumpy road ahead, Mr Speaker, but today's national accounts confirm that the economic recovery is underway, just as recent data in recent days has about house prices, about consumer confidence, Mr Speaker, about building sales. They all point in the same direction, that the Australian economy is gaining momentum.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain to the House how today's national accounts figures provide further evidence that our economic comeback from the COVID-19 recession is well underway?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Canning, who's a proud soldier who has worn the uniform and represented Australia abroad, Mr Speaker, and also across his electorate. There are around 60,000 constituents who are benefiting from the tax relief that was in this year's budget and legislated through the parliament, and around 20,000 pensioners and others on income support in the electorate of Canning who have been benefiting from the two $750 payments that have already made their way to the Australian people. Now, Mr Speaker, today's national accounts confirm that the economic recovery is underway, and this is the economic recovery that Australians have worked very hard for in the face of a once-in-a-century pandemic and in the face of the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. Quarterly GDP growth was up in the September quarter by 3.3%, the single largest increase since 1976, and this followed a fall of 7% in the June quarter. And while technically the recession may be over, Australia's economic recovery is not. And there is a long and hard road ahead, and there are many Australians who continue to do it very tough in face of this large economic shock. Now, Mr Speaker, this has been a consumption-led recovery in the context of today's national accounts, a boost in consumption of 7.9%, a significant reflection of the fact that the virus is coming under control and people are going about their daily lives. The biggest increases being in transport, in cafes, in restaurants and in hotels. Now, there were big jumps in every state and territory bar Victoria. We saw a 6.8% increase in New South Wales. We saw a 6.8% increase in Queensland. We saw a 6.7% increase in South Australia. We saw a 5.5% increase in Tasmania. We saw a 4.9% increase in Western Australia. We saw a 6% increase in the Northern Territory, a 2% increase in the ACT, but a 1% fall in Victoria, Mr Speaker. But for the situation in Victoria, if Victoria had achieved the same GDP growth that we'd seen across the other states, the GDP growth numbers for the September quarter would have been 5%, not 3%, Mr Speaker. It would have been 5%, not 3.3%. But the reflection is...
The Treasurer will pause for a second. The member for Gorton will leave under Standing Order 94A. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, the childish antics from those opposite can't detract from the achievements of the Australian people, a level of economic growth in this quarter that hasn't been seen in this country since 1976.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer and it refers to his previous answers. Why hasn't the Treasurer mentioned the following comments by the Reserve Bank Governor? And I quote, "What has become clearer, though, as time has passed, is that Australia is likely to experience a run of years with the unemployment too high and wage increases too low." End quote. In that light, why are you so delighted with yourself?
Members on both sides, the Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, today's result in the national accounts belongs to the Australian people, Mr Speaker. It is the Australian people whose sacrifice and hard work has seen the best quarterly result in the national accounts since 1976. It's the Australian people whose consumption has increased by 7...
The Treasurer will pause. The member for Rankin has a habit of asking a question and shouting wild interjections every 10 seconds through the answer. He is warned. Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, unlike those opposite, we are not talking down the Australian economy. We are pointing to the successful economic indicators that are showing Australians getting back into work. And what the Governor of the Reserve Bank has said is that the Morrison government's economic response has been the right response. What the Governor of the Reserve Bank has said just this morning is that the economic recovery is underway, Mr Speaker. And what the Governor of the Reserve Bank has repeatedly referenced was our programs like JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, with the Reserve Bank of Australia saying that our JobKeeper program has saved at least 700,000 700,000 jobs, Mr Speaker. At least 700,000 jobs have been saved by our JobKeeper program. Mr Speaker, and we've seen in the recent ATO data for the month of October that there are 2 million fewer Australians on JobKeeper and 450,000 fewer Australian businesses on JobKeeper in the month of October compared to the month of September. So the Governor of the Reserve Bank is absolutely right. The road ahead will be long and it will be hard and it will be bumpy. And the effects will be felt for years and years to come. But he also makes the very valid point that the economic recovery is underway and the Morrison government's policies are doing what they've been intended to get Australians back into work.
The member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. 2020 has been a challenging year for older Australians. Many retirees have put savings in government guaranteed term deposits because they're concerned about the share market and need cash reserves to help them get through. With the current cash rate at 0.1% and term deposits at best 0.6%, the upper deeming rate of 2.25% is clearly too high. Treasurer, when will the government assist older Australians and cut the deeming rate?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her question. On the 12th of March this year, the Minister for Social Services announced that the government had made a decision to reduce the deeming rates by 50 basis points each, and on the 22nd of March it was announced the deeming rates would be cut a further 25 basis points. And these reductions reflected the low interest rate environment that the honourable member pointed to. As of the 1st of May, a lower deeming rate of 25 basis points and an upper deeming rate of 2.25% applies. And as the honourable member will be aware, the deeming rate takes into account the returns that can be achieved by investors on a range of assets, not just cash deposits, but it can be on stocks in the stock market, Mr Speaker, it can be on fixed interest investments and a whole range of assets. Hence, there are two levels to the deeming rates. Now, our changes to the deeming rates have benefited around 900,000 income support recipients, including 565,000 people on the age pension. And as a result, they will, on average, an additional $313 from the age pension in the first full year the reduced rates apply. And this is expected to have been at a cost of $876 million over the forward estimates. So I'd say to the honourable member, the government has already acted on deeming rates. We continue to monitor movements, obviously, in the cash rate, but the government has taken action which has benefited pensioners right across the country.
The member for Menzies.
Mr Speaker, I asked the Treasurer would he remind the House how the Morrison government's budget, tax cuts and incentives are providing relief for Australian households, assisting businesses to generate more jobs and driving our comeback from the COVID-19 recession.
The Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Menzies, the father of the House, for that question, and acknowledge that in his electorate around 70,000 taxpayers are benefiting from the tax cuts that we announced in this year's budget and we subsequently legislated, Mr Speaker. And in the honourable member's electorate, in the electorate of Menzies, some 7,000 businesses have been benefiting from JobKeeper. And that JobKeeper program and those JobKeeper payments have been an economic lifeline to millions of Australians. Now, the honourable member refers to the various incentives that the government has been providing, both to households and to businesses, to support them through this once-in-a-century economic shock. And that has included tax cuts. Bring forward by 2 years our legislated tax cuts and adding an additional year of the LMITO, the low middle income tax offset. Now, those tax cuts are already starting to flow through to the bank balances of Australians right across the country. And according to Treasury, those tax cuts will help create around 50,000 jobs. But what was a key characteristic of this year's budget on October the 6th was that the government doesn't see itself as the solution. Government sees itself as a catalyst for a private sector-led recovery to this economic shock, Mr Speaker. And with nearly 9 out of every 10 Australian jobs being created in the private sector, what we did in this budget was put in place incentives to encourage more investment. For example, the loss carryback measure, as well as the immediate expensing incentive that applies to businesses with a turnover of up to $5 billion. This will cover around $200 billion of investment, and it will strongly support small businesses, because small businesses will be selling that new machinery or equipment. They'll be installing it. They'll be servicing it. They will be doing buying it themselves for their own businesses. And we've met many businesses across the country who are taking advantage, firstly, of the loss carryback, but also the instant asset write-off and the immediate expensing. In this budget, Mr Speaker, there was also the JobMaker hiring credit, a hiring credit which will help support around up to 450,000 jobs across the economy, and which was legislated through the parliament. And all these measures, Mr Speaker, all these measures are helping to drive more people into work. And just last night, we saw the OECD upgrade their economic forecast for Australia. And just today, we have seen the largest increase in quarterly GDP of 3.3% since 1976. So the Morrison government is getting on with the job it was elected by the Australian people to do, which was to help create jobs right across the country and help keep people in secure work.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The member for Bruce.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer, and I refer to the 28 times the government used their new comeback slogan in question time yesterday, though only 7 today. Can the Treasurer confirm his department's evidence to the Senate that the slogan came from an advertising agency and taxpayers are being slugged $15 million to put the slogan on bus shelters and billboards? How many of the nearly 1 million unemployed Australians would have a job if the government spent more time on jobs and less time on marketing and slogans?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for another Dorothy Dixon, Mr Speaker, because the comeback is happening, Mr Speaker. The Australian economy is coming back. The economic recovery is underway, and this economic recovery, this comeback, belongs to the Australian people. It belongs to the Australian people. And the reason why the economy is coming back is because of the measures that we on this side of the House have supported, Mr Speaker, and because of the hard work of millions of Australians right across the country, like JobKeeper, which supported 3.6 million Australians in September, Mr Speaker, like JobSeeker, which effectively doubled the safety net, like the cash flow boost, which has provided working capital to businesses right across the country, like our two $750 payments to millions of pensioners, like our home builder program, Mr Speaker, which has provided a spark to ignite the housing industry. And today in the national accounts, dwelling investment was up 0.6% after 8 consecutive quarterly falls, Mr Speaker. This is what we're seeing across the economy, the jobs coming back and economic activity gaining pace. Now, the AAA credit rating of the government has been confirmed, has been reaffirmed, Mr Speaker. We've heard from the Governor of the Reserve Bank himself talk about how the Morrison government's economic response has been the right response. We saw yesterday building approvals up by 3.8% and 14% through the year. We saw capital city house prices up by 0.7%. The first time we've seen capital city house prices up across all capital cities since the start of the pandemic, and we've seen consumer confidence up in 12 of the last 13 weeks, Mr Speaker. So every economic indicator points to the resilience of the Australian economy, and we know that the jobs are coming back, and 80% of those Australians who either lost their job or saw their working hours reduced to zero at the start of the crisis are now back at work. This economic recovery, this comeback, belongs to every Australian.
The member for Macquarie. The member for New England.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And look, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia, the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the McCormick-Morrison government's comeback support for the COVID-19 recession is assisting small business in regional Australia.
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for New England and the advocate for Hunter. We were there last week, weren't we, member for New England, in the Hunter, talking about announcing $560 million, that commitment for the Singleton bypass. Singleton, 26,000 vehicles, including 3,700 trucks, rumble through Singleton every day. And we want to get those vehicles, many of those trucks, off the CBD and onto the Singleton bypass, and we're going to do it. Member for New England, it's great to see the member for Hunters come back today into the chamber. And we were there last week. We were talking about infrastructure. We were talking about jobs. We were talking about the comeback. And what we were talking about was jobs. Now, in the member for New England's electorate, there are 20,000 small businesses, 6,100 of which have actually benefited from JobKeeper. And we regard those businesses highly. We thank them. We've got gratitude to them for making sure they stay connected with their employees, making sure they kept their doors open, making sure they turned the wheels of the local economy. And I know the member for New England supports each and every one of those small businesses, each and every one of those workers. It was also great last week to be in Toowoomba, another great regional community. And Garth Hamilton is going to represent that electorate of Groom finally in this place. He is going to be a superb member for Groom, and we will welcome him into this place very, very soon. And whilst there was Paul Friedman there, an electrical small business owner and operator, and he was very much looking forward to taking delivery of his new ute that very afternoon, paid for under the instant asset write-off. Of course, he had to have the cash flow, but that's going to make sure that his business not only survives through the comeback, but indeed thrives. And he was also making sure that he increased his business. And the Treasurer will be very interested to know that back in March, Paul was looking to downsize his business, but when the Treasurer announced JobKeeper, that gave him the incentive and the impetus and the optimism and the hope and the opportunity to add 2 new apprentices under the wage subsidy, to add to the instant asset write-off, to buy the new ute. It gave him the confidence to increase his business, and that's fantastic. Now, he provides electrical work for households, for commercials, and he was also delighted with Assistant Treasurer with the home builder, because of course new homes need wiring, and he's there. He's going to be able to provide that with the 2 new apprentices, a great businessman getting on with the job of creating opportunities for Toowoomba. The member for New England knows how important infrastructure and small business is. That's what we're doing, recovery from COVID-19, getting on with the job.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer, as Minister representing the Minister for Finance, who is responsible for Commonwealth assets, including the Lodge. Can the Treasurer confirm the Prime Minister is spending 14 days in quarantine with his photographer? Not the head of his department, not his Chief of Staff, not his senior health or economic advisors, not his national security advisor. Why is the Prime Minister always focused on photo ops and marketing?
Just before I call the Leader of the House,
there are a number of
members on my left.
As well as there being a number of detectable inaccuracies there, even using the fact that the Treasurer represents the Minister for Finance, that could hardly be said to be even inside.
Could the Leader of the House pause for a second? Could members on my left cease interjecting? The Leader of the House. If you could just rewind back a sentence, that would be helpful.
I'll do that, absolutely. Even allowing for the fact that the Treasurer represents the Minister for Finance in this House. The fact of personnel being in the Lodge, of which there are a number, as would necessarily be the case to support the Prime Minister, who exactly they are could hardly be said to be inside the responsible or officially connected public affairs of the Minister for Finance.
Member for Cowan is warned. I just say to those members interjecting, I can arrange a 3rd chamber for them, separate to the Federation chamber, out in the opposition lobby. I take the point that the Leader of the House made. Only the first part of the question, asking the Treasurer to confirm that the Prime Minister was spending 14 days in quarantine, is in order. The rest isn't. The fact that the answer is obvious doesn't mean it's not in order. We can see the Prime Minister there in quarantine. So if the Treasurer wants to address himself to the bleedingly obvious, he can, but the rest of the question is not in order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the House is aware, the Prime Minister undertook an important visit to Japan on behalf of this nation, where significant agreements were signed and where Australia's interests were advanced. And one would think at a time of an increasingly complex strategic environment that the Prime Minister of this country, becoming the first foreign leader to be invited to Japan to meet with Prime Minister Suga, is a very significant reflection on the positive bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan. So I'd say to those opposite, instead of making a mockery of an important visit on behalf of this nation, they should understand the significance of Australia's bilateral relationship with Japan, which has been advanced by our Prime Minister's historic visit only weeks ago.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is creating the right conditions for small business, including travel agents, to create jobs and drive our economic comeback from the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank my fabulous fellow Gold Coaster for her question. And as Gold Coast MPs, we know just how important small businesses are to the economy, because we've got about 80,000 small businesses on the Gold Coast, and we know that they are the heart and soul of our community. And Mr Speaker, that is the situation right across Australia, because small businesses really are the engine room of our economy. And that's why this government rolled up its sleeves when COVID-19 struck to make sure that we could cushion the blow as much as possible and support our small businesses, as well as the roughly 6 million Australians that are employed by small businesses. Now, Mr Speaker, we know that JobKeeper has been and continues to be a lifeline for so many of our small businesses. But promisingly, more and more of those small businesses are getting back on their feet. Now, Mr Speaker, our $74 billion JobMaker plan puts small business at the heart of our economic recovery. And we have put in place a number of measures that are specifically targeted to support our small businesses. So we have put in place some incentives for employers, for small businesses to employ and to invest. We have implemented programs that will support small businesses to innovate and to grow. And we have introduced reforms to make it easier for small businesses to do businesses. We are backing our small businesses right across Australia to invest in themselves and to employ more Australians. And one of the most important things that we have been able to do is to expand the instant asset write-off, because that has been such a bonus, such an incentive to so many small businesses as they are struggling to get back on their feet. But, Mr Speaker, the recovery has not been so smooth for all of our small businesses across Australia, and that's why we did step in to support travel agents. So eligible agents will have access to a one-off payment of between $1,500 and $100,000 to help them continue to navigate the challenges of COVID-19. And Mr. Speaker, it is really important that we support our travel agents, but we also support every small business right across Australia. So I would encourage all Australians, when you're doing shopping for Christmas, go to your local small business, support them, because every single cent that you spend supporting a small business keeps jobs in Australia.
The member for Hotham.
Thank you, Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. PIRSA is a pre-press operator who has worked at the Ovato Clayton site for 30 years. Like 300 of her fellow workers, she will be made redundant before Christmas. PIRSA won't get the money she's owed, and she'll have to wait until next year to receive any funds through the Fair Entitlements Guarantee. Minister, why is your government congratulating itself and using marketing slogans when workers like PIRSA are left out in the cold by this unscrupulous conduct?
The Attorney-General.
Thank the member for her question. As the member is no doubt aware, that's presently the subject of litigation, and both of the parties in that matter will make no doubt very strong arguments, and I think there are very strong arguments to be made on behalf of the workers that you're speaking to. The Fair Entitlements Guarantee is the established backstop to ensure that if that litigation does not end the way that the workers from Ovato are arguing that it should, that they have a guarantee of those entitlements, and obviously the government will be keeping a very close eye on that litigation and be ensuring that entitlements that are not paid through that process are paid through the Fair Entitlements Guarantee, as they usually are, as millions of dollars have been during the COVID pandemic, and as will be the case here, depending on how that litigation ends. But we are not a party to that litigation.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is working on reforms to support industries hardest hit by COVID-19 so they are able to regrow lost jobs and are stronger as we chart our comeback to a post-pandemic Australia?
The Attorney-General, Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her question.
Is now warned.
And as the Treasurer indicated in his earlier answers, there are obviously parts of the economy that are harder hit than others during COVID-19, and there will be a particular focus of the government. And through the working group process, where we've looked into key areas of potential industrial relations reform, we've had the benefit of data from the Fair Work Commission, which is a combination of both payroll data and survey material unique to the Fair Work Commission. And that data confirms what I guess common sense would tell us, that some of the key areas in the most distress have been the accommodation and food services sector, the retail trade sector, the arts and recreation sector and the aviation sector. And another fact that's clear is that small businesses, particularly in the accommodation and food sector and also very much the retail sector, have the highest level of award reliance. So in those most distressed industries with the greatest award reliance, there is a real capacity to assist those industries in their comeback by looking at the relevant awards. And one part of the key awards that has varied considerably from industry sector to industry sector is with respect to the flexibility that the award might allow employers and employees relating to restrictions on how they can work together to agree on more hours on a needs basis for permanent part-time workers on usual wage rate payments. And in some awards that can be agreed fairly simply. In other awards, there's even if you have complete agreement between the employer and the employee, there are very significant restrictions that discourage that type of agreement for extra hours being made. So hours never get offered by the business and everyone loses out. So you've got a situation, say for instance, in the hospitality award where there's considerable flexibility for more hours at usual wage rates to be given to permanent part-time employees. But in other awards, like in the retail sector, which is very hard hit during COVID, you don't have that flexibility. And the difficulty is that where you do have that flexibility, it also flows through into the enterprise agreements, and where you don't, it doesn't flow through. So where you have enterprise agreements with flexibility like Coles and Woolworths, and they have this flexibility to offer extra hours to permanent part-time employees, they actually have 75% of their employees on an ongoing, so that's permanent basis rather than casual, which is well over than 10% above the industry average. So if in this process we can find a way to ensure that where businesses are coming out of the COVID recession and there are more hours to offer, that they can do that simply by reasonable and fair agreement with their own part-time permanent employees so that they can get extra hours at their usual rates of pay. That would represent a barrier to more work, more permanent work and more hours that through this process we can conceivably take down.
The member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. In the past fortnight, 350 workers at Coles Smeaton Grange depot in my electorate were locked out of their workplace during a dispute over better pay and conditions. Coles has closed the depot for 3 months. Why is the government congratulating itself and using marketing slogans when 350 families in my electorate will have their income slashed over Christmas because of this unscrupulous conduct?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank the member for his question. I would invite the member to provide any further details that he's got with respect to that particular issue to my office. We have been obviously monitoring the way in which retail organisations such as Coles and Woolworths are engaging with their workers. We're clearly aware of it, but there are some details there that I've heard for the first time, and I'd very much like to receive further details on that. Whether or not that sort of a lockout is properly conducted because of economic conditions that are affecting retail is something that has to be determined. But if you've got further information on that particular issue, I'd certainly warmly ask you to send that to my office and we will look at it.
The member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister outline to the House how the important role the Australian agricultural industry will play in supporting Australia's economic comeback from the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Nichols for his question. Mr Speaker, despite the fact that agriculture has faced up to drought, fires, floods and now COVID-19, it's continued to prove that it is still one of the bedrocks of our nation's economy. ABARES previously estimated that despite all these headwinds that we would this year have an agricultural industry of $61 billion, up from $60 billion. And next week ABARES will update that outlook, and in fact we're predicting that will in fact go higher. Such has been the strength of the Australian agricultural sector, and such is the fact and the reasoning behind agriculture's ambitious goal of $100 billion by 2030. And in this year's budget, the government backed that with our own Ag 2030 plan with cold hard cash. And there are 7 pillars to our Ag 2030 plan. First pillar is around exports. Over $300 million invested in modernising our trading platforms and complementary measures, particularly around regulatory oversight, not only to protect our brands but to reduce the costs of regulation in making sure that our product gets around the world quicker. The second pillar, many say most important, is around biosecurity, protecting brand Australia. A record investment this year in our budget of $874 million in not just putting boots and paws on the ground, but also in terms of new technology, looking at underwater drones that will be underneath ships, making sure there's no hitchhikers underneath the boats of pests. Also in terms of scanners going into containers that will detect the movement of insects. So we're looking to technology to protect our brand as well. The third is also about protecting our brand, is around our stewardship, protecting our farmers and our environment for their environmental stewardship and custodianship of their land. $34 million in supporting them and looking at ways to not just reward them for carbon abatement, but the improvement in biodiversity, and also in terms of how they use that and put that into the marketplace. We're also looking at supply chains. That's the fourth pillar. And there's $1.3 billion under the modernisation of the manufacturing, which agriculture is seen as one of the key pillars of. And we'll continue to make sure we not just look at how we manufacture, but also at what we're exporting, but also our agricultural inputs. Also importantly is infrastructure, $3.5 billion in wanting to dig dams and plumb the nation. We need the states to come with us, but we've got the chequebook to go with them. We're also looking at our innovation systems, $86 million going into 8 new innovation hubs around the country, particularly in regional Australia, where our farmers can adopt the new science and technology, not just for drought, but for also improving productivity. But the most important investment is in our last pillar, and that is in our people. $250 million in this year's budget around ensuring that short courses, particularly in agriculture, can be undertaken, and a reduction of 59% in agriculture university courses. So as this government will stand with the agricultural sector, whatever the headwind it may face, in helping it achieve its goal of $100 billion by 2030.
The Minister's time has concluded, and I'll give the call to the member for Kingsford Smith.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Transport. Darren from Botany is a 52-year-old single dad who's been working as Qantas ground crew for 24 years. He was stood down in March. Darren said he was forced to sell his house to care for his kids and dad, who has dementia. He's one of the 2,000 Qantas workers sacked this week. Why is this government congratulating itself and using marketing slogans while workers like Darren are left behind?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Kingsford Smith for his question and acknowledge the fact that, yes, in the aviation sector, many employees have been stood down, and this is very, very unfortunate. And I am very sorry to hear Darren's story. I'm sure he's been a fine worker, and certainly we would like to see Darren back, making sure that he gets another job when the aviation sector returns to where some sort of level of pre-COVID. And we know that many industries are getting back to somewhere where they need to be as far as pre-COVID levels, but as Alan Joyce, the CEO of Qantas, has only said in recent times, that even up to Christmas, the pre-COVID levels for domestic travel will only be 60%. But what we have done with aviation is provide sector-wide assistance, $2.7 billion of sector-wide assistance through the domestic aviation network support, through the regional airline network support, to ensure that we have planes in the air. Because, as I've said many times, planes in the air means jobs on the ground. And we need to see more planes in the air. We need to see more jobs in the aviation sector. And I do wonder whether the member for Kingsford Smith, I appreciate that he's certainly coming from an electorate very near Mascot. I appreciate the fact that he has engaged with these employees, as have I. And we want to see more people working in the aviation sector. But it's been very tough. The border closures, and appreciating the fact that Western Australia is only looking to resume domestic travel with other states and lifting those border restrictions, only made that announcement this week. It's been very, very tough with border closures in many Australian states. Appreciating the fact too that international travel is of course very, very restricted. We're bringing as many Australians home of course as we can. We're making sure that those stranded Aussies have an access to get home before Christmas. But it is so tough in international inbound tourism, in international inbound people coming home, stranded Aussies. It's so tough as well domestically. It's so tough regionally. But that's what we have done on a sector-wide assistance basis. We have provided that support to the entire aviation sector, $2.7 billion worth of support through JobKeeper, through DANS, through RANS. We want to continue, and we will continue, and we must continue to support the aviation sector. But as I say, it is very tough, particularly for people like Darren, and we will continue to provide the support as is necessary.
I call the member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister please update the House on how Australia's high-quality exports continue to support Australian jobs and our economic comeback following the corona pandemic? Thank you.
The Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for their question. And I'm sure the honourable member would join me in just saying how wonderful the images have been in recent days of those family reunions right around the country, many of whom are the hard-working men and women of the resources sector who have been out there doing what was necessary in recent months to maintain not only their jobs but their employing businesses, their sector, Australia's reputation and, of course, Australia's economy. So I put my thanks once again on the table to them. Our economic recovery has been in no small part thanks to the decisions and the work of those Australians right around the nation. Now, the member knows that the Port of Gladstone, which I've visited a number of times, is an incredibly important part of the sector. In fact, over 1,900 vessels visit the port every year. 70% of those vessels, Mr Speaker, are seeking our coal. Some 20% are seeking our gas, and they're looking to ship them to markets all around the world, helping to build our economy and jobs for Australians in this country. Now, Mr Speaker, the member knows this as well. The Australian resources sector deserves a gold star. They deserve a gold star in terms of the economy and what they've done. And to quote the Attorney-General from yesterday, their performance in recent months has been nothing short of remarkable, Mr Speaker. It has been remarkable. Resilient, outstanding, fantastic, and they deserve every piece of recognition that they are getting from us and others. So, Mr Speaker, we will continue to support the resources sector through the $225 million Exploring the Future program, $53 million for gas-fired recovery, $30 million for the Central Queensland University School of Mining and Manufacturing, because we understand how important the sector is to Australia and its economy and the ability to drive more jobs, more GDP and more opportunities for Australians, particularly in areas like the member for Flynn. Central Queensland, home to coal, home to exports, home to jobs, home to the fighter for Flynn. There are great opportunities right across our country in the resources sector, and we will continue to support them as they support us. So no matter whether it's iron ore, Mr Speaker, whether it's coal, whether it's gold, pick your poison, Mr Speaker. Any of those commodities are doing great guns. They're doing an incredibly good job. Our coal, Mr Speaker, is some of the highest quality in the world. $55 billion in the sector, 48,000 jobs. I was in the Hunter recently, Mr Speaker, to see just how good a job they're doing. 96% roughly comes out of that port of Newcastle is coal, exported to the world, providing opportunities. And it's not just about exports, Mr Speaker. If we look at the hydrogen energy supply chain project in Victoria, what are they using as feedstock to produce hydrogen? Brown coal, Mr Speaker. Brown coal. It's cheap, it's affordable, it's in Victoria, they're using it. There's an opportunity here into the future, and we will continue to drive those opportunities. And, Mr Speaker, when we look at the Australian economy, when we look at the reports today from the Treasurer and others, when we look at what's been happening in recent months, well, the Australian economy, the comeback is equivalent to a great Queensland origin team, Mr Speaker.
The minister's time has concluded, mercifully. The member for McNamara.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations, and I refer to the tragic death of delivery driver Chow Kei Shen, who was killed while riding his scooter on a delivery run in Melbourne in October. He dreamed of one day owning a restaurant with his family and working as a chef. Will the government's industrial relations changes include basic protections for workers like Chow Kei Shen so they can work safely?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
I thank you, and I thank the member for his question. I had a very productive and informative meeting with Michael Caine from the Transport Workers Union yesterday and representatives of the types of workers that you're speaking about. Some of the things that we discussed in that meeting was the fact that is acknowledged, I think, inside the union, that occupational health and safety for those drivers is not just predominantly, but essentially a state-based responsibility. Well, this is how these laws work, and understanding how they work actually allows you a path through to whatever changes can be made here to ensure greater safety. But there's no doubt that there are issues to be addressed here as the gig economy gets well and truly indentured into the area of deliveries and food deliveries. We had a conversation about that. There's no doubt there that there is a leadership role for the Commonwealth to play, and what I've undertaken to do is to ensure that that issue as to how these particular sectors of the gig economy are operating under state-based occupational health and safety laws goes right onto the agenda of the relevant ministerial council that deals with those, and that we can use Safe Work Australia to shepherd that process to try and understand exactly how those laws are not operating in the most efficient way with respect to those drivers. There clearly is an issue here, and my deepest sympathies exist for those families and those drivers who have had these accidents. That was a productive meeting that we had yesterday. There is work to be done here, but we can't lose sight of the fact that there is a predominant effect here of state occupational health and safety laws. There is a leadership role for the Commonwealth to play, but the primary response is at a state level.
The member for Ryan,
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister update the House how the Morrison government is investing in the Australian Defence Force so our servicemen and women can have the resources they need to keep our nation safe as we chart our comeback through the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister representing the Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for Ryan for his question and thank him for his strong support of our defence personnel that live in his electorate not too far away from Nogra Barracks. Mr Speaker, obviously the first role of our government is to make sure that we can keep Australians safe, and we've endeavoured to do that through closing our borders internationally to keep Australia safe from COVID-19, and we have worked very hard off the back of that to rebuild the economy and help people get back into work. But it is apparent, Mr Speaker, to all Australians, and certainly it should be apparent to all Australians, that to have a secure nation, it is absolutely non-negotiable as a precondition to us being able to have a prosperous nation, and we won't compromise on that principle. Mr Speaker, the work of our servicemen and women, both here domestically and internationally, is something that should be of great pride to all Australians, and the work that they do has to be backed up by the appropriate investment, and it's why we are putting a record amount of money, in fact more money than any government since Federation, into our defence personnel, Mr Speaker, and we are very proud of that, and it's as a result of having managed the budget well over a number of years, making tough decisions so that we can invest into our Australian Defence Force. Over the next decade, Mr Speaker, we are spending $270 million. An amazing investment and a well-deserved investment for those men and women, because we know that that work to modernise the Australian Army, to make sure that we can invest, for example, $55 billion into the land domain capability over the next 10 years, will make them one of the most professional forces in the world. And Mr Speaker, under that program there is a $5 billion Boxer Combat Reconnaissance program. It will deliver 211 vehicles, and the majority of those will be built at Rheinmetall Australia's Redbank facility, not too far from the member's electorate in Queensland. And the remarkable thing about that is that over the 30-year life of the Boxer, Australian industry is expected to secure over $10 billion worth of work. So it means small manufacturing firms in electorates right across Queensland, in fact right across the country, will be able to provide component parts and work very closely with this program and others. And the point, Mr Speaker, is that that investment that we're making is not only supporting our servicemen and women, but it is creating jobs in the suburbs across the country. So at a very difficult time in our country's history because of the COVID virus, we have, through our investment into defence, been able to support people in jobs, and those jobs will continue to grow into the future. Mr Speaker, it doesn't stop there, of course. We're investing in air and sea capabilities, and we'll make sure that we continue to do that.
The member for Maribyrnong.
Come back, kiddo.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. Can the Minister confirm that by the 25th of January 2017, the government was in possession of Commonwealth data warning the government that almost 9 out of every 10 robo-debts issued were wrong and needed to be reassessed, resulting in a decrease to the debt?
The members on my left, the Minister for Government Services has the call.
Look, thanks, Mr Speaker, and thank the member attempting a comeback for his question. The member's reading from the second further amended statement of claim put forward by Labor's lawyers. It's a statement of claim that both the Commonwealth
Members on my left
and Labor's lawyers have acknowledged is not an admission of liability, does not affect any acceptance of the allegations, and does not reflect any knowledge of unlawfulness. Mr Speaker, 2 days ago I tabled a letter from 1994 showing that the use of averaged income data was well and truly alive in 1994. The House will be pleased to know I have now got to the bottom of when the use of averaged income began, and it began when the Hawke government released the Data Matching Program Assistance and Tax Act 1990. We now know when averaged income began. It's on page 3 of the document I tabled 2 days ago. 30 years ago this year, the Hawke government started the Data Matching Program Assistance and Tax Act 1990, and that began the use of averaged income from the tax department. But then Labor, of course, came and doubled down. Media release from the member for Sydney, the member for Maribyrnong, dated June 2011, a new data matching initiative between Centrelink and the tax office.
I just say to the minister, I've allowed him to compare and contrast, but this question didn't have a preamble. It was very specific. He has addressed, I believe, with relevance. His answer's been very relevant to the question at the beginning of his answer. He's now providing a whole lot of additional material that goes beyond what he was asked. He can certainly cover that material if he's asked a question about it, but he hasn't been. So I just invite the minister to come back to the question or wind up his answer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I will table the letter, including page 3, to give the House full information about how the data matching program began.
I thank the minister. The Leader of the House.
I'm tabling the letter, including page 3.
I thank the member for Isaacs. The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's investment in the defence industry is supporting Australian jobs, Australian businesses and defence personnel as we come back from the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Reid for her question and especially thank the member for her support and passion for Australia's defence industry. She, Mr Speaker, is an excellent example of the diversity and quality of the members of the Morrison government. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government's $270 billion worth of defence capability is contributing significantly to the comeback from the COVID-19 recession. We are supporting Aussie jobs and Aussie businesses as we support our men and women in uniform so that they can defend our nation and keep us safe. Mr Speaker, this week I announced that the Morrison government will invest $220 million in Lend-Lease to upgrade works at the RAF base in Edinburgh in South Australia, supporting some 200 Australian jobs. Mr Speaker, in the last 12 months, Lend-Lease has employed more than 18 veterans across Australia on a variety of projects through groups such as Veterans in Construction and Soldier On. Lend-Lease says that these veterans have the skills and capabilities that are incredibly valued in the civilian workforce, and I congratulate Lend-Lease on their employment of veterans right across Australia. And whilst on my feet, Mr Speaker, may I encourage our other industry partners to employ more veterans and those transitioning from ADF so that they can take advantage of their incredible, invaluable skill set. Recently, Mr Speaker, I had the pleasure of visiting Penton, which is a cyber technology company based here in Canberra. Penton received a $520,000 grant to support the construction of a secure ICT facility. Mr Speaker, I'm very proud to say that just last week, Penton was named the Cyber Business of the Year at the Defence Connects Industry Awards, so a very big congratulations to Penton. Mr Speaker, with our government, from the government's support, Penton has been able to grow during COVID and has just hired their 100th employee, so well done to Penton. Mr Speaker, our government continues to support Victorian jobs and businesses in the defence industry, and one of those businesses is Melbourne-based Anywise. Our government has invested and backed Anywise to develop new technologies through our Defence Innovation Hub. They are developing a system capable of monitoring the health of Army's bridging equipment. Mr Speaker, just recently I was contacted by Adam Evans, who's the Managing Director of Anywise, and this is what he said. Thank you for your ongoing support. For a Victorian SME, this contract makes all the difference between a dark or a light Christmas season this year. After our lockdown recently, this news could not be better timed. Mr Speaker, our comeback from the COVID-19 recession is creating a stronger defence industry, making sure more Aussie jobs, making sure we are backing more Australian companies.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services, and I refer to threats by the then Human Services Minister in 2016 to victims of the Prime Minister's illegal robo-debt scheme, and I quote, "We'll find you, we'll track you down and you will have to repay those debts and you may end up in prison." Why was the government threatening victims with prison when it was its own ministers that were breaking the law?
The Minister for Government Services.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. On the 9th of May last year, the member for Maribyrnong did a press conference at the front of Redcliffe Hospital. When asked a question, he said, "We want to make sure that people aren't receiving welfare to which they're not entitled to, and no one gets a leave pass."
I won't call the Manager of Opposition business. The Minister has to be relevant to the answer. I've allowed him latitude, as I do, to compare and contrast, but you cannot start your answer with material that isn't relevant to the question. The Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The government has a lawful requirement, as we all know, to ensure the appropriate collection of debts. That's something the member for Maribyrnong made clear on the 9th of May last year when he said that people aren't receiving welfare to what they're not entitled to and no one gets a leave pass on it. The member for Sydney in 2010, if people fail to come to an arrangement to settle their debts, the government has a responsibility to taxpayers to recover that money. Labor's own words make it very clear that the responsibility to recover debts has always...
Members on my left will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, the minister should be able to give a direct answer to an issue where people died, where ministers broke the law, and that minister threatened people with prison while he was breaking the law.
The Manager of Opposition business will resume his seat. I'm just going to remind the Minister again that there wasn't a preamble to the question. It was a specific question. He needs to be directly relevant in his answer, and in doing that, he needs to address the question that was asked, not just deal with material that is on the policy topic but not having dealt with the question itself. The Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel. Will the Minister please outline to the House what steps the Morrison government is taking to ensure positive mental health and well-being for our veterans, ADF personnel and their families?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I do thank the member for Herbert for his question and recognise his service to our nation in uniform. And, Mr Speaker, throughout our nation's history, more than 2 million Australians have served with great distinction in uniform, and often they are the first people that we turn to when problems get too big for our state agencies. We saw it last summer with the operations Bushfire Assist. We've seen it all this year with COVID-19. We've relied on them for peacekeeping missions and conflicts throughout our nation's history. And, Mr Speaker, that service to our nation can have impacts. And when you consider that the average Defence Force career in 2020 is about 7 years, we need transition measures in place. And it's a partnership between the Department of Veterans Affairs, between the Australian Defence Force, between ex-service organisations and the community at large. I want to stress, though, Mr Speaker, that for the majority of men and women who serve, that transition goes very well. But there is no question that some do require additional support. And my message today to those serving men and women and our veteran community is that help is available. You are not alone. The Open Arms Counselling Service is available on 1800 011 046, and it's not a sign of weakness, Mr Speaker, to reach out for help. In fact, it's a sign of strength, and it's also a chance to get better sooner. Mr Speaker, Australians can be very proud of the support that's actually in place for our veteran community for the well-being of their families. We provide, through the Australian taxpayers, more than $11 billion per year, with $230 million specifically put aside for mental health programs to support the mental well-being of our veteran community. And there's no question, Mr Speaker, that 2020 has been a very tough and challenging year for many people, and the recent media coverage has certainly added to the anxiety and stress for many in our community. The last thing, Mr Speaker, that our veterans need now, that Australian Defence Force families need now, is our judgment. They need our support. They don't need our judgment, they need our support. The overwhelming majority of Australian servicemen and women throughout our nation's history have served with great distinction, and they can be proud of that service. And you have nothing but the respect and the thanks of a grateful nation. We must not allow the alleged actions of a small number of people to define or in any way diminish the service of the vast majority of men and women. We need to let the process take its course. And it's a partnership, Mr Speaker. It's a partnership, as I mentioned earlier. It's a partnership between our veterans and our serving men and women and the broader family and the broader community. So I urge all of our veterans, all of our serving members, to check on their mates. Check on their mates. Maybe ring 4 or 5 of them up this week. Check on your mates. Support each other. And I urge the Australian people to continue to support them through the Department of Veterans Affairs and through the ex-service community. But I'll finish where I started, Mr Speaker, and just say simply, thank you to our servicemen and women. From the recruits who I watched march out of Kapooka last week, right through to the Chief of the Defence Force. We respect you. Please continue to serve with the pride that you rightfully hold, and please uphold the values of the Navy, the Army and the Air Force. Thank you.
I think the Leader of the Opposition's indicated he just wants a brief indulgence on the Minister's answer.
Speaker, just very briefly, Labor, and I'm sure all members of this House, stand in support of our veterans. We should all be very grateful for the men and women who wear our uniform, and at a difficult time such as this, we do associate ourselves with the comments of the Minister in terms of reaching out to each other, but for those of us who aren't service men or women, we should encourage all Australians to reach out to those who proudly wear our uniform and defend our nation.
The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and with that I'd ask that further questions be placed on the notice